All right, just a little bit about me. My name is Logan Huskins. I've met quite a few of you before. I'm a software engineer here in Oklahoma City. I work remote for a company called Live Auctioneers out of New York City. We're a company that hosts online auctions that basically parallel the physical space auctions that you'll see. I don't know if you've ever been to one or you've seen one on TV where people will have the hammer and gavel and talk really fast and point at bids. We basically let them also host those online and stream them so people can bid on items. It's pretty neat. I get to write full stack applications there. We're writing React, Go, Node. We got some cool stuff. You should check it out. Right now we have a listing for an auction that has the first Apple computer in it. So that's really cool. It's not like the first run of Apple computers. It's like literally the first Apple computer. So that's pretty neat and exciting. Has anybody here used React hooks yet? A couple people. Awesome. If I say something wrong, call me out. Make fun of me, yell at me, whatever. It'll all be good. Everybody else, hopefully you'll learn something from this. So what are React hooks? React hooks are a new way to write components. And when I first heard they were making a new way to write components, I got a little stressed out. I know probably many of you jumped from jQuery stuff and Knockout stuff to Angular stuff, and then now we're writing, people mostly settle down on React. There's some Angular, some Vue, but there's a lot of people who've settled down on React. And now we all get to relearn how to write components. So it kind of never stops. But hopefully React hooks are going to be, I think, a much easier way to write components. And I think they really simplify the process. So I think it'll be worth having to learn another new thing. React hooks allow us to write stateful components without classes. And I also kind of rolled my eyes when I heard that, because my initial thoughts with that was, what's so bad about classes? Classes in JavaScript aren't great. They're not perfect. They're kind of syntax sugar. They don't have all the things you would expect classes to have, but they're in the language, and they're the direction the language is heading. Maybe we should just get used to them and use them and try to make them better. But after seeing hooks, I really think that getting rid of those classes is probably a good thing. Because we're getting rid of classes, we no longer have this set state. We no longer have lifecycle methods. Losing lifecycle methods, I think, is probably the big good thing, because lifecycle methods, as hopefully I'll demonstrate, can be kind of a mess sometimes. So why do React hooks exist? React hooks, I think, first and foremost, make it easier to share code between your components. There's lots of reasons that the React team has mentioned that they've created hooks. They're trying to kill a bunch of birds with one stone. But I think the biggest one is that it makes it easier to share code, and I'll demonstrate that once we get to the code. React hooks allow you to not have any more unrelated logic inside of lifecycle methods, which goes back to sharing code. It provides an abstraction that simplifies testing, so that logic that's in lifecycle methods can now more easily be pulled out and tested. And another side benefit is that functions are easier to optimize with JavaScript's just-in-time compiling when they're not classes. With classes, the optimizers have trouble telling what methods on those classes are going to be called at runtime. Functions, you don't have that problem. So it allows better optimization as well. Nice little side benefit. So let's look at some code. I made a little chat app for this. It's kind of an odd chat app. The only people you can chat with are Kanye West and Megacorp customer service. So not a lot of people are online right now. Kanye West sends us quotes. He loves to sleep. It's his favorite. And we can type back. So I can go ahead and type me too. Can everybody see this all right, by the way? Cool. And then he'll type us another Kanye West quote back to us. Or we can chat with Megacorp customer service. Right here will show us that who we're actively chatting with. And the window title contains who we're actively chatting with as well. So we're chatting with Megacorp customer service, and the agent will be with us in a moment. There are a bunch of people in front of us, and we can chat with them as well. And we're going to look at a couple of the components that make up this chat application and rewrite them with React hooks. Customer service is kind of bad. So we're going to start by rewriting the component down here at the bottom that handles the actual text input for the messages that we're sending. Is that good? Can everybody see that? Is that perfect? Great? Awesome? Cool. So right now, I'm going to go ahead and just kind of walk over what the class does. We have the class message input, and it extends React component. It has a constructor that binds some of the methods on it so that we can use this in them, and it sets up the state. The state contains the message that we're currently typing, which is empty, because the input form is empty. Anytime we type, it calls handle change, which then sets the state to the new input. When we click submit, it calls handle update, which makes sure that there's actually a message there. It uses a function called send message that's passed into the properties to send the message off. It resets the state, and then it prevents the default for that form. And then we've got the JSX that handles it down here. So let's go ahead and rewrite this with hooks. We're going to get rid of that export default and name this something else so that we can just export message input. Now, the only thing worse than watching somebody typing is typing in front of a lot of people. So please bear with me while I do this. I told myself I would never live code, and here we are. We're going to go ahead and destructure the props that get passed in. Those were send message. I believe that was the only one, so we can go ahead and destructure that. So we have access to it. OK, so because we have a class, we don't have state, or this dot state. So let's go ahead and take this JSX, bring it back to our function, and it is going to not work for obvious reasons. But let's just make sure that our application actually isn't working like we expect. Great, it's not working. Cool. That makes sense because we don't have any of the methods this depends on. So we're going to go ahead and remove where we are setting the message in that input form. And we need to make the functions for handle update and handle change. Now, because we are using a function, they don't have to be like methods on the class. They can just be functions inside that function. So now our component should probably render, except value is empty there. So it won't render because we didn't give it a value for that message. So let's just put it in an empty string. Still not rendering because we're using this. We no longer need this on any of these method calls. Cool. We're back to where we were. We can just no longer type messages, which is expected because we haven't implemented that yet. So because we no longer have this dot state and this dot set state, we need to have something that we can use to set what's currently in that message. And that's where hooks come in. We're going to import our first hook, use state. So let's go ahead and call that. We don't know what it returns yet, and we'll go over that in just a second. But we're going to call use state. And we can give it the initial state of the message, which is just going to be an empty string. Use state returns something kind of odd, and it'll be probably the first hurdle to get used to. It returns a tuple. It's going to return an array with two values that you're going to destructure. The first value it returns is the variable that holds the current state. So it's going to be message. So right here we have message, and that is going to replace any call to this .state.message. The second thing it returns is the method or the function that you use to set the message's state. We're going to call it setMessage. So now we have the current state of what message is in that variable message, and then we have the way we update it. So instead of calling this .setState, we can just call setMessage to set the message. So let's go ahead and replace our value with message. And we're back where we were. Great. So, like in our class component, we need to handle when that form changes. So I want to go ahead and copy and pull this up. Nope, didn't work. Doesn't matter. We're just going to type it. So instead of calling this .setState, like we normally would have done here, we can just call setMessage. Not working. We're doing it live. Please bear with me. Event.target.value, is that not right? Event.target.value, that's right. Set message, handle update. Oh, handle change. Thanks. Cool, now we can type in our form. I think right off the bat, that already looks a lot better than calling this .setState. I know it's just aesthetics, but I think aesthetics matter. You're looking at this all day. It's nice for what you're looking at to not be miserable to look at. Compare that to what we have with setMessage. So now let's go ahead and handle the update. I'm actually going to copy it over this time. To make sure we actually have a message, we no longer need this .state.message. We destructured send message, so we don't need this .props for send message. We don't need this .state here because we have message in scope due to that. And we don't need set state anymore. We're just going to call set message and pass it that empty string to reset the input on that form. And now our input form is working. So compare this. This is what? 19 lines of code to this. Now, I mean, I admit I was a little bit terse with some of this, intentionally, because I wanted it to look good when I changed it to hooks. But it's like 30 lines of code. And I think that use state here is going to be a little bit less unruly than set state is. Do we have any questions about any of that? Great. So one of the things you need to keep in mind when using hooks, it's just going to be one of the barriers to using them, is basically that these hooks have to be called at the top level of the function component. So you can't call use state inside of an if statement or inside of a loop or anything like that. It has to be called in this function, preferably right at the top. You can use state as many times as you need to in that function. So say we also had color or something. We could do const color set color equals use state red. These use states have nothing to do with each other. It's just a function that's returning a value and returning another function that we can use to update the state.
So is that a default value?
The question was if the thing that I pass into use state is the default value. Yes, you can pass it nothing and it will default to null. Or you can pass it a number or a string or whatever you need the default value to be. Any other questions? Does that initialize what it's going to expect when you update it? Are you talking about the type of the variable, like if it's a string or a number? It's JavaScript. JavaScript doesn't really care. You can kind of give it whatever variable you want to, and it will assign it to that thing. So instead of red, this could eventually be 5. It wouldn't be helpful because 5 isn't a color, but it could be 5. Oh, repeat the question? The question was if this cares about type, basically. And the answer is no. It's JavaScript. JavaScript doesn't really care that much about type. For better or worse. Cool. So we have got everything working now for that input form. So the next component we are going to look at to illustrate some different purposes is this sidebar. This sidebar handles some logic. Maybe it shouldn't, but it's an illustration. It handles who you're currently talking with. It says active next to their name. And it also updates the document title in the tab up here. Cool. So we've got our component. Our component's online, extends React component. So let's go over what this does. Is everybody familiar who uses React with lifecycle components on a React class? Cool. So when the component mounts, that is when the component basically initially renders in to the application, we set the document title equal to chat and then who we're chatting with. We also need to verify that when we change who we're chatting with, we handle that appropriately. So we call component, so on component did update, We check if the previous props chatting with being the person we're chatting with, if it doesn't equal the current props version of chatting with, and if that's the case, we reset the title. We do that because we don't want to reset the title anytime any one of the properties updates. This will be where our next hook comes in. And then we've got our render down here, and all it does is it iterates over the users that are online, and it displays it, and it registers an on-click for them. For when you click it, it changes who we're chatting with. Anybody have any questions about what that class is doing before we refactor? So let's get rid of defaults. Name it something else. Let's go ahead and destructure all the props that it uses. It uses chatting with, change chat with, and users online. And let's go ahead and copy over what it's rendering. Luckily, this class doesn't have any methods that we need to change other than the lifecycle methods. So we're going to go ahead and, actually, I don't believe we need to do anything on this one to make it work. Great. So it's working. But as you see, we are not setting or updating the title on the tab. That is what our next hook is going to do for us. So we were doing that in those lifecycle methods. We no longer have access to those. So we'll introduce our next hook, use effect. I think use effect is kind of the big one. It's the one that makes hooks do things differently and makes it easier to use these functional components instead of using the class components that you were before. It's the main hook, if you were asking me. So use effect replaces the lifecycle methods like component did mount, component did update, component will unmount, and we're going to be using them in those terms, but eventually we're going to try to stop thinking about them in terms of the lifecycle methods because they do behave a little bit differently. Use effect is just a function. It's not returning anything. And you pass it a function. The function that you pass, use effect, gets called the first time the component renders, and then every subsequent re-render of that component. So let's copy over what we had in component did mount. Because it is running on the initial render, it is replacing component did mount. We don't need the stop props anymore. And let's look at our application. Fantastic. The tab up at the top, oh, you guys can't see that well. It's saying chat with Megacorp.cs or chat with Connie OS. It's saying who we're currently chatting with. There's a problem, though. I said this replaces component did mount, component will unmount, and it is also replacing our component did update down here. So basically, anytime any one of these props changes, and it's causing this component to re-render, we are rerunning use effect. And that's inefficient. Imagine you're doing something in there that's a little more complicated than just setting a document title. You don't want to do that every time. It can cause weird UI issues. It can look ugly. It just can be slow and use a lot of resources. Use effect accepts a second parameter as well. That parameter is an array, and what you do with the array, it's a dependencies array, basically. What you do with the array is use effect will take any properties or anything you're listening for updates for that use effect, and it will only run use effect when that thing is updated. So we only want to run use effect when who we're chatting with changes. So we're going to add chatting with to use effect. So now we're getting the initial render of use effect. So when it first renders, running it, and then it will only run on any subsequent re-render where chatting with changes. Great, it's still updating, exactly what we need. But now it's not re-updating every time it re-renders anything in that component. This array is, I lost it. Where'd it go? I changed tabs. That's what happened. This array is kind of fancy too. You can pass it an empty array. And what that means is useEffect will run on the initial render, and then it will listen for updates to nothing and never re-render. So if you run it this way, it basically is a one-for-one replacement with component did mount. As you can see, maybe or maybe not, the title at the top, we are not updating when we change who we're chatting with. All right, so do we have any questions about the basics of how useEffect works? Question?
So, is there any naming convention for use state?
Yes. The question was, are there any naming conventions for use state or any of the other hooks? There are naming conventions. The React team released a bunch of ESLint plugins alongside of hooks. And if you name them the specific way that they ask you to name them, you can get nice errors from ESLint when things happen. So you want to name anything that setState is doing. So anything that useState is doing, you want to name the first thing message, and then the next thing setMessage. So whatever you name the first variable it's returning, you're setting set the second thing as the second variable. We didn't name anything here in useEffect, but we're going to show some more examples here pretty quickly where we are going to be naming things with useEffect, and I'll show specifically what you need to name with those when that happens. Do we have any other questions about useEffect?
So just the variables that you're placing, those that you're setting listeners on those?
In the array?
Yeah, the useEffect functions.
The question was, the variables that you're placing in the useEffect array, are you setting listeners on them? I don't know exactly how it's working under the hood, but that's the concept, basically. So instead of down here, where you have component did update, and if you've used React before, you know in component did update, you generally want to check if because the component did update gets called every time the component updates. You want to check if that change that you're looking for actually happened. So we're checking if the previous props version of chatting with does not equal the new props version of chatting with. Dropping the variable in this dependencies array right here is exactly what that's doing. So we have a bit of a change in scope. The bosses want to know how long you've been chatting with a specific person. So instead of us rendering active up on that tab, we're going to just be we're going to render how long we've been chatting with that person instead. So I'm going to implement it in the class so we can see how messy it can be, and then we're going to re-implement it with hooks and see how much more contained and easier it is. So let's call this online old because we don't want to export it, and we don't want it to be used in our export. Set this back to online and the default export. Let's double check, make sure everything works, because if I don't check in small chunks, I'll break something, and you'll have to watch me debug it. Great, it looks like everything's working as intended. So now instead of rendering active, we want to render a time here. So what we're going to do, we're going to create state because we need a place to house what that time's value currently is. So state equals object time 0. And we need to destructure it so we have access to it. So now we're rendering the time, but the time isn't changing because we haven't implemented that yet. So for our timer, we need to take component did mount, and when this component mounts, we need to create a timer. So we're going to do this.timer equals set interval, the function that contains our updates, and it's going to run every second, every 1,000 milliseconds, which is a second. So every second as this set interval runs, we need to increment the count by 1. So we're going to call this .setState. So every time the interval runs, we are incrementing the count in our state by 1. We also want to be sure that when we navigate away from this component, the timer cleans itself up, or else you'll have a memory leak. So for instance, say this chat component was being used in 20 different places in your website, and users are hopping in and out of it all the time. You don't want to create a new timer every time they jump into a timer and let it keep running indefinitely. When they leave the timer, you have to clean it up. So that's where component will unmount comes in. Component will unmount is running when the component unmounts. So we're going to clear our interval, this dot timer. I should probably check here if that timer exists. This isn't a production application, it's just a demo. So now when we navigate away from chat, we're clearing up our timer and preventing those memory leaks. Great, we have an incrementing counter, and it follows us between who we're chatting with. The problem is this doesn't fit our spec. Our spec says we need to know how long we've been chatting with a specific user, so we need to also reset the timer. So we're going to do the same thing that we did with the title. Whenever chatting with changes, we're going to set the timer back to 0. Timer's counting. We change it, timer resets to 0 and starts counting again. Great. Now, if you've been writing React for a while, you know that this is kind of a mess. Or if you're just watching, you might know this is kind of a mess. We have 3 lifecycle methods here, and we are spreading the code out to handle one thing between those 3 lifecycle methods. So we're creating our timer here. We're deleting our time here. And we're clearing our timer here. We're not deleting our time, we're setting it back to 0. That's logic for one thing in 3 different methods. We also have in our component did mount where we set the title. So in component did mount, we're doing 2 completely unrelated things. That's going to make it really hard to share this code later if we need to. In component did update, we're listening to the same property chatting with, but we're doing 2 completely different things. It's going to make it hard to share this code. So we've got 2 things the lifecycle depends on, spread out between 3 methods, kind of all mixed and mashed together. And this is one of the inherent problems with how lifecycle methods work. So how do we resolve this? Hooks. We're talking about hooks. That was the answer. It was hooks. Does anybody have any questions about how the timer was set up? Nope. All right. So the first thing we need to do is we need to create state for our time and the way to update our time. So let's go ahead and import use state. Pop quiz. What is this going to be? What is this? Tuple. What is the first thing in the tuple? The content. We called it message before because it was the message we were currently typing. So we're going to call it time this time because it's the variable in our state that is holding what our current time count is. The second thing that is returning, once again, is going to be the function that we can use to set the time. So this is what we're going to be concerned with when we're wanting to update our time. So I went ahead and changed it out in the JSX. We're back to where we started with the 0 time following us by who we're chatting with. Now we need to go in and have a way to replace our component did mount, our component will unmount, and our component did update. So we're going to set a new effect. We're going to create a new effect. And all these effects are doing are allowing your functional components to have side effects. The lifecycle methods are just there so your components can so your class components can also have side effects that aren't in the render function. When you mount the component, it has a side effect of setting the title and creating a timer. We want to have the same side effect that when we create the component and render it for the first time, we want to create a timer. So let's go ahead and do that. Fun thing about hooks is we can encapsulate all of the references to the timer variable inside of this hook. So const timer equals set interval, not immediate. We want interval. Interval, there we go. Same thing, we're going to set it to run every 1,000 milliseconds. Every time set interval runs, we want to update our time. So what we can do is we can do set time. And for those of you who've used hooks, I'm purposely introducing a bug right now. Don't yell at me, I'm explaining it when it comes up. We're going to do time plus 1. So every time we set the time here, which we are doing every second, we're taking the current time, which we no longer have to get from state because it's in this variable up here. We're taking it, adding 1 to it, and setting the new time. I'm going to run this, and it's going to be a mess. It looks like it's incrementing fine, but as we get further and further, you'll notice it's very, very jumpy and weird. We'll explain this, or I'll explain this. I'm going to actually quickly comment it out because I don't want my browser to crash because of a memory leak. So, it'd be bad, right? If it just crashed while I was up here, it'd be not a great idea. So there's a couple things going on here. One, when we leave this component, we need to destroy this timer as well. Just like we did in that component we'll unmount. How we do that is useEffect returns a function, or it can return a function. I'm going to call that function cleanup. It doesn't have to be called cleanup. That's not a naming convention. I'm just going to call it cleanup for clarity. I'm missing lots of things. You can type really well when your keyboard's like right at the right level, but then when you're tall and the thing is low and you're trying to talk, it's a mess. So in this cleanup, we're going to write the code that cleans up our timer. We're going to clear our interval. Our interval is timer. So this is where useEffect is not going to be a one-for-one replacement of those lifecycle methods, and we need to start thinking about our React components on different terms. So useEffect runs when the component first renders, and then when anything causes the component to re-render, like we mentioned before. Cleanup runs prior to any time we rerun useEffect. So it's going to go like this. We load the component in, render it for the first time, run useEffect. Something changes that makes the component re-render. We run the cleanup, and we run useEffect again. Something comes in that makes it re-render, cleanup, useEffect. So basically, cleanup is going to be running before from the second run of useEffect on, we're running cleanup before we run useEffect again. So what we need to do with this, this is creating a timer every time something causes the component to re-render as well. useEffect is causing the component to re-render itself. We're incrementing the time, which causes the component to re-render, which causes the use state to run, which causes the time to increment, which causes the component to re-render. We've got a loop here. This is basically the same problem you would have in component will update when you don't check your properties that they're actually changing. So this is going to be another bug for anybody who's written hooks. I'm going to go ahead and add the dependencies to only run whenever who we're chatting with changes. We don't want to run this useEffect anytime time changes, because then we'll run into the infinite loop of it re-rendering our component basically indefinitely. But this is going to be one of the things that's going to be a hang-up with how useEffect works. We're going to show our debug console here, and this is actually going to cause a problem. Right here, we're getting an error message. React hook useEffect has a missing dependency, time. So this is one of the things that useEffect has to have. If it references a variable, if it references a state variable or a prop or anything, that state variable has to be in the dependency array. I'm not sure about the internals of useEffect. It's just one of the things you have to do with useEffect. So because right here we're using time to set time, we have to also include it in our array. But that puts us back to where we started. Anytime we set time, we're going to be re-rendering the component which causes useEffect to run, which causes us to set time. I left some information out for you guys intentionally so I could show you this. The setters for these stateful variables, you can pass them a value or you can pass them a function. That function will have access to the variable that you're setting. So let me show you what I mean by that. Oh my goodness, typing. So basically, you pass it a callback, and that callback is going to get an argument, and that argument is the variable you're updating. Kind of like with setState, how you can get state back from setState. So when you call like this.setState, and then you can have an arrow function that has state in case you need to reference state in your setState function, we're doing the same thing here. So, and I'm going to change the naming so it'll be a little more clear, because I think this isn't quite clear. But this time that's right here is not this time because of this scope. It is this time. So we could call this something different. Let's just call this inner time. So this inner time has the same value as the time from our use state without having to reference the variable time itself, which allows us to remove time from our dependency array. Great. Now we have the incrementing counter. We're still not resetting it. See, we have 10, 11, 12. We change it, it's going to be still 10, 11, 12. So in our cleanup function, because our cleanup function is running before every time our use state reruns after its first run, we can set our time and set it back to 0. Since we're not actually referencing that time variable here, we're just referencing set time, we can just set it directly without having to use that function. And we should have a working timer if I did everything right. We've got a working timer. Great. Does anybody have any questions about use state replacing life cycles, or how, or the problem we ran into with these dependencies, or what cleanup does?
I'm confused about how do we know cleanup runs every time before the update?
So,
Because we're returning.
yes, that's one of the things use state does. The function that you return from the function you're passing use state. So we have this function we're passing use state, right? This arrow function here. Whatever we return from it, I'm sorry, not use state, use effect. Whatever we return from use effect, if it's a function, will get ran prior to every rerun of use effect. The question was, how is cleanup getting ran? So just to reiterate, when we use useEffect, it runs when the component first renders, and then it's going to rerun on any re-render of the component. Any re-render of the component caused by these dependencies. So it won't re-render for everything, it'll just re-render for chatting with. Prior to every rerun caused by a re-render, it runs the cleanup method because we are returning it from useEffect, or from the function inside of useEffect. Does that make more sense? Okay, awesome. Any other questions about anything? Question?
In your cleanup function, you set time to 0. How is that not resetting the timer?
The question was, in my cleanup function, I'm setting time to 0. How is that not resetting the timer?
I guess the better question is, doesn't it re-render every time the time changes?
The addition to the question was, doesn't it re-render every time the chime changes? And that's a good question. No, it's not. The reason it's not is because we have this dependency array down here. So with the dependency array, we're only re-rendering when something in that dependency array changes. So if we didn't have the dependency array, it would go 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, or something weird like that over and over. Yeah, if I put comma time in there, it's going to re-render every time the time changes. We'll get in a loop. So let's just see what that does, what it looks like. I don't know if you can tell, but there's very brief flashes of a 1 in between the zeros. It's a weird bug, and it would be hard to debug if you didn't know exactly what was going on there. So I mentioned before that React hooks allow us to share logic between our components a lot easier, but I haven't really shown that off. I've only shown how it breaks that logic out of the lifecycle methods and into their own methods. Well, we can create something called custom hooks with React hooks. Custom hooks are basically our own versions of things like useState. So what I want to do is I want to take all of the timer logic in this custom hook, or in this useEffect, and break it out into its own custom hook that can be removed from this component and imported anywhere in our application. So we're going to create a function called, and this is one of those things that I mentioned earlier that is a naming thing that you have to do that was brought up earlier. It has to be called, so any custom hook has to be called use something. So we're going to call it use timer. And we can basically, this is going to be great, we can basically take all of this logic, including the time that is outside of the useEffect, and rip it straight out of our component. So now in our custom hook, we are using this time like we were before with the useState. We are calling useEffect, passing it all the stuff we were before, and here's where the magic kind of happens, we can return time from this. So we can do const time equals use timer, and time will have the value of our time. Now we won't be able to update it anywhere in our component, but we don't need to. All of the timer logic is handled in our use timer custom hook. The only issue we're running into is that we don't have access to chatting with here. So it's going to rerun that useEffect every single time anything changes, basically. Well, it's going to be null. I don't know when it's going to rerun it. I don't want to know. Null's bad. Don't use null. We can just pass it chatting with. So any prop or any other state that you need in your custom hooks, you can just pass it in. It's just custom hooks are just functions. So now I hope it works. Let's see. Great. It's working great. So now, if we want, we can take this use timer custom hook, put it in its own file, and use it anywhere we need a timer in our entire application. So instead of it being stuck in those lifecycle methods, joined with the document title updates, just that component, it can be used anywhere. It handles its own cleanup. It handles when it should be updating. It does all of the work for us. We can also take use timer and put it in an NPM module and use that NPM package and use that NPM package wherever we want. There's already a ton of custom hooks out there that you can just import straight into your project and use right away, including several timers, because timers are the easiest example. Do we have any questions about custom hooks?
Is it ever very common to return back a function if you needed to update the time manually?
The question is it ever very common to return a function if we needed to update the time manually? I haven't done that. Let's find out. I don't know, but let's do it. We're doing this live, guys. And let's just, I'm trying to think of the best way to do this. Man, that's way too much work. This is just going to be a wild example. Could also do that. I want to see the time be really big, though, so I'm just going to do it here. Big time. Yay. So yeah, you can do that. That's a bad idea. Yeah, I'm not cleaning any data. Nothing's happening over here. I hope nobody's like, somebody could totally find my IP on this network and what port that's running on and send messages to me. Please don't. Do we have any other questions? The question is, the reason why I'm using use for the naming convention for the custom hook, is it because of the linter? Yes. React hooks, like I showed you that error earlier where I wasn't adding the right dependency because I was using the state variable inside of useEffect. It said, hey, you need to add time as a dependency because you're using the variable. It knew that because the linter knew it was a React hook. Using the use keyword prior to those functions allows those same very good linter errors to yell at you when they need to happen. I actually don't know how that's going to affect you if you're using use for function names inside of your application already for other things. That's something I haven't looked into and just thought of, so I'm going to try to break this later. But does anybody have any other questions? Question?
So is this kind of like a recommended way going forward to create stateful components? So it sounds like you're kind of getting away from classes, like in their recommendation in the React hooks.
The question was, is this kind of the new recommended way to write React components, since we're getting away from these classes and into these functions that have React hooks to handle state? I'm going to talk about that here in a second, but the answer is primarily if you want to. Any other questions?
This might be related. This or Redux? Because isn't this basically what you can do with Redux?
The question is, this or Redux? Isn't this basically what you can do with Redux? No, it's not. So something I probably should have mentioned. So our use timer custom hook, if we share it multiple places in our application, so if we import it into multiple components, it does not share state. It only shares the logic for the state. So this timer won't be the same timer we're using everywhere. You can think of it sort of as a new instance of the timer. Does that answer your question? Awesome. You will still be using Redux if you're using Redux now. Sorry. Question?
Okay, so say I reuse this timer in two different places, and one of the components I'm using in is conditionally rendering. Would that potentially, if it was rendering before this previously, would it accidentally get tripped up with its state and grab the other one's state because of the ordering?
You're going to need to repeat that. Can you repeat that for me, John, please? Because I got the first half, and then I started thinking, and then you kept talking, and I lost the second half.
Okay, so if you were using this in two different components, and the first one is conditionally rendering, and so you render it, and then it stops rendering that first one, could the two states get mixed up because of the ordering, and it try to grab the second one's state?
I don't know. The question was, if you are rendering two components that are both using this timer, the first component is conditionally rendering, and then you no longer are rendering that component because the condition fails, can it mess up your state, basically? Can it flip your state around? I haven't done that. I don't know. My assumption is no, because if it did, that'd be a really bad thing for them to release in React. I trust them, and I assume the React people know what they're doing and have tested that. I haven't tested it because I'm not on the React team. Unless there's somebody watching that wants. I'm just kidding. I don't know the answer to that. The answer is probably no. Any other questions? Question. And then I'll come to your question. But your question first, because I saw your hand first.
So you've been using single values in your state. Can they be objects and then the function can, smart update single values in an object?
The question is, I have been using single values in my state. Can the thing you pass to it be an object, and then can you update properties on that object? Is that the question? I believe so. Haven't done it. Let's try it. Where's the thing that I did that broke everything? It's down here. I want that gone. I don't want everything broken. I don't need that. So we're going to call it time.currentTime. And pass useState an object with current time, set equal to 0. How is this going to work? We are going to change line. We do need to change line 16. Yeah, thanks. So we're going to be returning that whole object now. For set time, we need to set time to current time 0. And for here, we have inner time, so we can return current time, inner time plus 1. If this works, will this answer your question? Is this kind of what you're talking about? I assume it works. I haven't tried it. It'd be weird if it didn't. Object to object. I'm rendering something wrong. Yep. Inner time.current time. Once again, we're doing it live, guys. Looks like it's working. You had a question. I thought somebody would catch that, yeah. The question is, have I used use reducer? Because this is sort of parallel to it. There are a lot more hooks than just the two I've shown. I feel like the two I've shown are probably the most foundational. They're the two you have to understand to do anything. But there's one of the hooks is use reducer. Use reducer is basically works like a Redux reducer would work. You can pass it an action and it will perform things on that action. So for our timer, since our timer is based on the previous state, we're always incrementing the timer by 1. We could use the hook use reducer, dispatch the action, increment the timer by 1. Could have definitely done that. I felt like showing off this is better than showing off that right now. But there is a use reducer as well. And there's a lot more hooks that I recommend everybody go and look at. Other questions? Question?
If I have a couple different things in my state that I want to change, like with use effect, should I use like different use effects?
The question is, if I have a few different things in my state that I need to change inside of a use effect, should I use different use effects? I think it more depends on why that state is changing. The answer is probably not. So for instance, if you were always at the same time incrementing the time, and say we also had a state called color and you were changing the color. So it was going back from red to green. Since they're tied together, the purpose of the use effect is more for the timer itself, less than it is the state you're updating with the timer. So I would go ahead and do it in the same thing. But if these two states that you're updating don't have anything to do with each other, like the window title that we updated and the time, I would do separate use effects. That way you can put them in custom hooks if you need to. You can export them wherever you need to. Yeah. Other questions? Cool. I've got like 2 more slides, but they should go pretty quick. How do you use hooks? Hooks were released about 3 months ago in React and React DOM 16.8, so you need to have both of those. Hooks can be used alongside class components. So you can have an application that is both class components and React hooks. You can have class components and a functional component using hooks in the same file. It doesn't matter. Classes are not going away, and you can continue to just write classes if you want. But I would recommend any new components you write, if you want to, if you have the time, go ahead and write them using React hooks. Any new application I write from here forward is probably going to be using React hooks. And any new components I write where available is going to be using React hooks. This was sort of a naive example. React hooks is a naive example because React hooks open up a lot of possibilities for how you architecture your components, particularly if you have a component that does all of like the logic and then you have it returning, like it has a presenter component or something that is a child of that. You can restructure how your components are working because of how this new state is working and how the custom hooks are working. Most components you rewrite may not necessarily be one-to-one rewrites like that, where you just make it use hooks now. You may want to take a step back and look at your component tree and say, how can I, now that I have access to all of these things, how can I rewrite this hierarchy to use hooks in a way that kind of may get rid of some of the nesting I have that I may not need. And we have a few resources. Anything React related, I would say before you go look at stuff on like Medium or somebody's blog or whatever, read the documentation on React's website. It's very, very good, and I think it's better than most of the stuff you find anywhere else. They put a lot of thought and care into the tutorials and the documentation for React. Now, there's more specific things you may get into where you Google it and you find something on Medium that does exactly what you want or teaches you to do exactly what you want. But if you're just learning hooks, read the hooks tutorials and documentations on React's website. There was also a talk last September-ish where they first revealed hooks when they were in alpha or beta or whatever, called React Today and Tomorrow and 90% Cleaner with React Hooks. And it's some of the React team, and I think it was the guy who wrote or helped write React Router, talking about React Hooks, why they exist, and how to use them. There's also a good library that one of my coworkers sent us the other day called Stop Runaway Effects with React Hooks. Kent Dodds made it. He makes a lot of good stuff and teaches a lot of good stuff on the internet. It lets you, basically, if you have a use effect that's running a lot, like if you have a use effect running like 60 times in a second, it's probably too much and you're probably doing something wrong. So this is a development library that will yell at you if it thinks your use effect is wrong. So I think that's pretty handy. Do we have any questions about anything else? Testing. I think because you can do those custom hooks and pull them out of the component did mount, update, all of that, it's going to make testing a lot better. Because you can test that hook itself, and then use that hook everywhere instead of having to test each of your components individually that are using bits and pieces of that hook, bits and pieces spread out between the lifecycle methods. I think it's going to make things much easier. Anything else? All right, have a great day, guys.